Hey, welcome to the Next Creators podcast. Today we have Chase Freo. Hi, Chase.
Hey Sasha, it's nice to be here.
Nice. Maybe we can start by you mentioning what you're working on.
All right, so my name is Chase Freo. I'm the CEO and co-founder of OPGames. Essentially, we facilitate mini esports in casual and hyper-casual games with crypto as a buy-in and crypto as a payout. It's a lot more nuanced than that, but in a nutshell, it's a lot of interfacing with Web3 in general, blockchain and crypto, and the whole shebangs. I could go ahead and explain that in the next couple of hours, or not hours though, next couple of minutes that we're talking. So that's who I am. That's what I'm working on.
Cool. Maybe we can start essentially with gaming overall, since you've been working gaming for a while. When did you start in gaming? What was the kind of also era in gaming at that point in time, and how it evolved through your time?
Yeah, so essentially I got involved in gaming by accident actually. It's a serendipitous sort of like situation where I was on a sabbatical in China. I took a sabbatical from finance. I was working in Singapore. I moved to China, and then in one of those drunken nights as a foreigner traveling around the country, I met somebody who was in gaming it was a basic conversation of like, hey, what do you do here? I was like traveling, and he was like, oh, what about you? I work in gaming. I run a gaming company, and I was like, oh, cool, that would be awesome. And he was like, okay, why don't you come over and see if you'd be interested. And so the following day I did a little bit hungover, and then it was like a small group of like 5 or 6 people in a very small studio in Chengdu in China, and they were like, "All right, what can you do though?" And I was like, I don't, I'm doing finance, so that's not something that I can do in China." But they were like, "Okay, maybe you can do marketing or business development for outside." And that's kind of like where I started. And at that time, that was the the era of free to play, like the the beginning of it, so to speak, where you can get away with mediocre games but still earn a huge sum of money, just because there wasn't a lot of options just yet. Then eventually things became more competitive after that.
Interesting. And how did the space evolve as you joined it?
Well, it was very fast. The requirement for quality games became so fast that in 2010 you can get away with terrible, crappy game user experience, but still earn a lot. But accelerate it for like the next 2 or 3 years, and it was different. Clash of Clans came out. The bar has been raised, and Supercell has been raising the 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 quality in terms of like the types of games that are there. But in essence, like it's a really fast acceleration of game quality and the game experience that's needed. But at the same time, people have figured out somehow, like paywalls and like how they could go ahead and continuously make money off of the people in general who would buy into these little microtransactions just to progress into the game. So it kind of became like pay to win, so to speak, and that kind of like changed the way games are made. It sort of like shifted the types of creatives as well in the publishing space, just because of the fact that a lot of publishers are now going the safe route of being formulaic, of having these certain types of games because that's the thing that they know will make money. And I felt that, at that point, there was some sort of like a slowdown in some, the creative liberties that a developer can do, just because they're tied to either doing something revolutionary or amazing, as opposed to like getting a publishing deal and making money out of what they're doing. So it was a balancing act at that time. And I think it still is until now.
And how would you also describe like indie gaming as a phenomenon? Was it a kind of like parallel universe, its own movement and thing, or was it intertwined with casual gaming?
I think that a lot of like indie games in general um, have this amazing insight in terms of like what a game should be, originality wise, concept wise. But it just doesn't blend well on the most typical publishing model, just because sometimes when you put in these payment structures or like these economic loops within the game, it somewhat changes the experience. And so somehow there's a niche for indie gaming, but at the same time, when you go sort of like mainstream, or I don't even want to call it mainstream, but rather those are, the apps or games that makes money, it's a completely different thing altogether. And that's why I feel that when I was in publishing, circa 2012 onwards, um, like sometimes you kind of like have to balance the games that you're investing in, wherein a lot of them are typically those that are guaranteed to make money. But every once in a while, you throw in the mix something that's just really interesting, just really amazing, even though you know for a fact that it's probably not gonna make as much. I mean, you recoup for the loss. Like it's basically hit-driven economy, right? Like you publish 12 games and you have one game that's a hit, and that's more than enough to recompense the whole thing that you've spent in a year's time for publishing the rest. So yeah, I think it's a different niche on its own, and it somehow, um, like it changes the moment you put in this free-to-play aspect that is very prevalent on mobile.
Hmm. And maybe you can also describe a little bit, double click on the relationship between publishing um, side of the industry and also game studios. Like how do they work together?
So a lot of times, at least during that period of time, game studios are, they have the capability of building great games, right? Some of them are invested in by bigger companies. Some of them are bootstrapping, but game popularity became, synonymous with 2015, 2016. A lot of this, game studios are now looking for game publishers to sustain themselves. And so a lot of times, game studios would either build for themselves, but in most cases, they're actually building in relation to the game publisher that they wanted to be published with. So let's say, for example, one game publisher publishes a lot of like casual, hyper casual games. Then this game studio would definitely make something that would appeal to this type of publisher so that they could get the marketing push that they need. They could get the funding that they need. So, think of it as sort of like a bigger entity that would enable you to reach a bigger market, which you wouldn't be able to do or would be very difficult for you to do if you're a game studio developing games and at the same time publishing your own game. I think that's kind of like where the difference is. Um, and I feel like like if the democratization of like how the distribution works somehow gave rise to like really creative game studios that have made their games very viral without the help of uh, big publishers. So that's kind of like the relationship between games studios in general and publishers. Publishers, here's the money. Um, we'll market your game as much as we can. We have connections. All you need to do is just do live operations, make sure that there's like weekly events in the game to make sure that there's monetization looping into the game every week.
Hmm. And then maybe now we can start with discussing a little bit about your first involvement in crypto. Like, how did you discover crypto? When was it?
No, well, actually, it was early on, but I wasn't an early adapter, and I kind of regret that to be honest with you. So I was working in finance, circa 2008 to 2010. Um, First heard about Bitcoin. I was like, well, I don't know what to think of that, but I brushed it aside, and then eventually worked my way through Ethereum, and I was like, okay, well, good. There's a cryptocurrency. There's something going on right now in crypto. But it wasn't until 2017 when I first dipped into it. Early 2017, I was like, okay, you have this one office mate that wouldn't really stop talking about it. And you go like, okay, sure, I'll give in. Let me try that out and see what it is, see what all the rage is. And so I got myself my first crypto, Ethereum in 2017, and then at that time, Bitcoin was also sort of like one of those things that people talk about, at least in the forums in not like the whole wide world yet. So I did that, and then I met my co-founder, Gabby and Paul, um, because they were game developers and I was a game publisher. And in one of our conversations, we're like, "Hey, why don't you go ahead and try our game and see if this is something that you guys can publish?" And I did, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to publish the game. It wasn't the right fit. I said no to them. But the cool thing about that is, we discovered, through that, we are, the three of us are looking into the same space, like blockchain and crypto in general. And through that, we're like, why don't we go ahead and start a company together? And that's where our first company was born, which actually it is still our first company, Alto.io. But that's a different story altogether because there's a pivot that happened through that.
And so, what was the original idea when you just started on Alta, and what did you learn through the process?
So 2017, at the end of it, so CryptoKitties was hitting off the market, CryptoPunks was there, and so we're like, okay, I think that NFT is going to be a thing. We have to do NFT, definitely something that has to do with gaming. So the original idea was, how do we cross the bridge, or at least set a bridge between game developers and crypto and blockchain in general? And the very first thought was like, hybridizing a specific game, like let's say a Final Fantasy game, or like any kind of mobile game, to be honest with you, RPG, MMOs, and having NFTs in that game while the game is running with centralized assets, right? Because it's kind of hard to foster adoption with quick change, especially if you're dealing with legacy businesses with free-to-play gaming still working for them. I mean, freemium games, free-to-play games is it's kind of like really oppressive though, in such a way that only 10% of most of these game developers are actually, or studios are actually earning the top 90% of the revenue in the App Store or in the Play Store. And so the remaining 10% actually are basically sharing the crumbs. And our thought process was, you know what? If there's blockchain involved into it, if there's like this NFTs involved into their games, then maybe it would change because you're democratizing the ownership of these assets. But what we've learned there was that the mindset still need to change. It's not something that would happen overnight, and you're building picks and shovels for these game developers, but they don't have the paradigm shift just yet to actually pick up these tools and change the way their games are being run. And so, we've been evangelizing NFTs since 2008, 2017, 2018, and then 2019, and then lately, just a couple of weeks ago, when the art world is somewhat having this golden era of like NFTs selling like pancakes. Or I wouldn't even say pancakes, that's too cheap, right? 69 million for an NFT, right? So most of those game developers that I've spoken to are sort of like reaching out again and saying, "Hey, I think we're ready. I think we want to try out and see what's going on." So really, like the adoption and like the growth of the space, um, it's really hard to tell how that's going to happen, but it does require a lot of movement. It does require a lot of like being a daredevil somehow in terms of like the things that you do, because most of the time, like in the very beginning, it's just really difficult to convert things, and that's kind of like what happened to us. We felt that at that time we were too early, and that we may have to somewhat pivot a little bit into a much lower hanging fruit that addresses issues within the games industry as a whole. And that's where OPGames came in with crypto tournaments for casual and hyper casual games.
Hmm. And before we go into Outplay to discuss the hyper cash flow games and P2P tournaments, what was the kind of wanted to double click on like what was the difference in mindset and challenge was changing the mindset among game developers? Was it a shift to like open economy away from the point in time when you kind of control everything, uh, or is it something else?
I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. If you look at game developers right now, there is a model that works out really well for them. And that model is, how the ecosystems of both the app stores and the Google Play Store has built. The game engines, for example, it allows them to easily connect ads into their games as well. So this sort of like closed loop economies are basically fueling them to succeed, right? But as a lot of game developers find it difficult and struggle to sort of like monetize their games a little bit better, they're sort of like trying to find avenues and ways as to how they can expand um, how they build their games. Right now, I think that what the sandbox is doing, what these metaverses are doing, is actually trying to show the way that there's another method as to how you can create games. It's just a matter of moving out of that ecosystem that Apple and Google built, at least for mobile, and then head on to another ecosystem that you could potentially build something more amazing. And it's a work in progress. I think that even now, the movement of game developers in the traditional space is still very slow, and that a lot of the game development companies or studios that have extra manpower or an extra development arm could use them as research while still continuously building on a much more proven method for them that has worked out for them for the last couple of years. But the thing is, we have to remember that not all of these game developers have the luxury of time and money, and that's why even though like there's a lot of success stories in game development, there's also a lot of failures. And I think that's kind of like what's pushing them to sort of like look into other options as to what they can do. And the metaverse being one of them, crypto tournaments being one of them, because there's plenty of ways as to how you can actually deliver a great game with blockchain and crypto in tow.
Hmm. And how did you come with the idea of Outplay? What was the insight? Was it particular developer or a group of people or something else?
Back in 2018, we worked with this company called Antler Interactive. Um, it's they have this game called Crystal Kart, which is a racing game where you can buy um, different types of cars, and there's different types of racetracks that you can race it around, right? And what they wanted to do is to also have um, blockchain-based cars, which is basically going to be sold in OpenSea. It's limited edition number of cars, right? And we did that with them. Um, the great thing was like it was all a buzz in terms of like, oh, okay, like this game has NFTs into it, right? But the implementation is just still very basic at that time, right? You basically have your wallet information which shows up in this game, and once you put it in, you will have that car being played in that specific game. So my account, put in my wallet ID, and whatever NFT I have for Crystal Card will show up in that game. So we did that. And then we realized that, at this point, it still doesn't add up to the value of the game. Like the game is good in itself as a centralized game. It's an amazing game, and that whether or not there was crypto or NFT involved in that game will still be bound to be successful. It would sell. The users are still inclined to buy the centralized assets, the in-app purchases. That what we've learned really here is that like you have to build a game from the ground up for you to really um, include a much more inclusive economy within the NFT perspective. And so that would take time. That would take the paradigm shift that I was talking about. That would take expertise to understand as well how development in blockchain works. And so I think that this year hopefully we could get to have more of these types of game developers to at least explore the space and to build something that's not framed within the model of the iOS and the Google Play stores, um, because they have their own thing going on in there, and I think that they're not the one to somewhat share their infrastructure to create something different. That's the reason why I think that the way games will move within the blockchain and gaming space is essentially starting in from the blockchain space and slowly inching into the mainstream and into Web 2 gaming in general.
Hmm. And so, do you think then the majority of the innovation, bottoms up innovation, will start happening on a browser side of things, or it will be also like other distribution systems, non-mobile ones like Steam or Epic?
I think that could work, but I think that the reason why like I see browser as one of the most instrumental innovation is because of the fact that it's probably the easiest to work with. Plenty of open source games. There's plenty of HTML5 game developers, for example. The types of games are not well. It's not that huge though in terms of like um, the market share in general, but it's huge in terms of like the numbers of games that are there. And I feel like the web games and browser games are the most underserved within the gaming space, just because of the fact that there isn't really a platform for them. It's just browser game. You type a link and you get in. It's not curated within the app stores or the Google Play stores or even Steam, for example. So people can become very creative in terms of like how they do things. These are by no means like huge MMO games like World of Warcraft, but it's really closer to the creator as opposed to um, a massive game studio. So here you see independent game developers, hobbyists, those that have their own day jobs, but at the same time codes at night and create mini games or games that sort of like fuel their passion and their creativity. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is a market and growth to be had here, and it sort of like fits well within the values and how blockchain in general works. Because some of these games, once they do it, they open source it so that other people can also build upon it. You just credit the main developer, but at the same time, you can build upon a specific game and put it on your platform or put it in wherever it is that you want to distribute it to. So it's really more collaborative. There's no walled garden that sort of like prevents you from looking at one game and building upon it. So I think that's the reason why I think browser is the best play to begin with, and then move on to a much harder uh, ecosystem to crack, which is games built on Unity that's specifically made for iOS or for Android. Um, but yeah, I feel that that's kind of like where the future of uh, gaming and blockchain is, at least on the Web 2 to Web 3 side of things.
And maybe we can also touch on this culture of game jams. And it seems like there is like almost like a two kind of parallel groups, or maybe it's the same people but work in different sides of gaming industry. There are people who are working on like blockbuster games and things like that, right? But then there are sometimes the same exact people, or also a different group of people who would take vacation from their work, but actually do the game jam. And so they almost like do something for the heart on their free time, and then they do the work in bigger gaming companies. So like, what is game jams, and how do they work?
Yeah, well, essentially, these are like really amazing people joining game jams. You think of it as a hackathon. You're given a theme of like what the game jam is all about, and then you create a game out of that specific theme. For example, as a game developer, you can there's like it's a community. There's a huge indie game community that builds a lot of like different passion projects in games, right? And a lot of times they don't monetize on this one. A lot of times it's like just really for the love of creating games, right? And joining a game jam allows them to sort of like have that semblance of recognition, bragging rights as well as being able to actually showcase what they've come up with or what they've worked on with that they're very proud of, right? And so, in essence, I think like it sort of like knits the community together. I would say sort of like the Olympics of individual creators during a period of time. There are several different game jams all over the world. Some are small, some are big. But for example, JS13K game jam with Andre, which will happen like in the next few weeks as well, or it's actually happening now. Last year, I believe it was the theme was 404 or something like error 404, right? And so they've created different types of games around that specific theme, and it's actually amazing how the creativity flows through their kind of work. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really good to have game jams, because it just sort of like brings the community together, and you see the creativity and the great amount of work put into these specific games.
Hmm. Got it. And maybe now we can go into a section overall that will help maybe some listeners who are like new to the space or who want to see um, what you learned in your career throughout the time. Are there any particular books or mentors that greatly shaped your life?
I think in terms of books that I've read over the last couple of months, um, I, I'm gonna throw a couple of things. Tools for the Titan, this is pretty good. Culture Code is one of those books that I actually like reading, and I always recommend other people to read. But also a lot of like being in a space where you need to be creative. There are a lot of books that you need to actually explore other than being the realm of games. So whether that's fiction, whether that's philosophy, I think that having a vastly um, expanded knowledge on a lot of different things, even though you don't remember half of it, sort of like allows you to draw inspiration a little bit. So that for me, I think would be the types of things that I've been doing. Lately I haven't been reading that much. I used to like have a goal of this, like, okay, at least one or two books every month, but now I'm falling behind that. But yeah, so those are the things that I do. And then there was another question which completely slipped off my mind. After the books.
Or maybe some kind of mentors in space that's or
Oh,
like
mentors in the space. Yeah. I would say in general, the way I learned um, you know, gaming and publishing is really not to have. But I did not have like that kind of mentor where who took me under his wings and sort of like gave me all the insights and knowledge that I need to know. It's really from working on the ground up. And a lot of times those insights came from the people who actually just have the passion to make games, specifically game developers. It's super refreshing to actually talk to them because as a creative, you'd basically get into their heads in terms of like what's their motivation of like creating this specific games. Why are these game mechanics the way it is? And these all came from the guys that actually build these games from the ground up. And so that's the reason why I think that sometimes wisdom and understanding and knowledge upon things sometimes doesn't come from somebody who'd grant it for you or grant it to you. It would come from the experiences of the people that you work with. And I think we have to somewhat recognize that. Specifically now that I'm running my own company too, I try as much as possible to learn from the people that work with me, because that's kind of like where it should come from in general.
yep. And also for creators starting in the space, what do you think where they can start like surrounding themselves either with content or people to navigate their early journey in the space?
I think for creators, it's really important to reach out to communities. That's where you'd kind of like be able to dip your toes in. It depends. It doesn't really matter what kind of stuff you make, like whether you create like small mini bite-sized games or art in general. There are always communities for that. Um, like it's you have to have patience because not all communities are built the same, and some of which are not aligned with the types of values that you have as a creator, as an artist. And so you have to somewhat find your tribe, and it's kind of like a hit or miss thing. It's one thing that you create and you build stuff, but it's another thing to actually connect with people that actually appreciates it and understands a much higher purpose for what you have created that would enable you to somewhat expand your circle, expand your distribution network. and then eventually find your niche within the thing that you're doing, whether that's art, that's games, or whatever else, or music.
Hmm. What advice do you have for somebody who is considering the space like crypto and also gaming, crypto gaming, or intersection of those two, but actually doesn't think it is for them? Like, how would you encourage this person? Or
There were situations that happened where I'm talking to my colleague in the gaming space, traditional game space, but feels that crypto and blockchain isn't exactly the way to go. And I typically tell them that I see your point. Like there's comfort in being safe. There's comfort in knowing exactly what you need to do with your eyes closed because you've lived and breathed these things. And as you can see, my dogs are barking. If you can hear that, um, uh, but the way I'm seeing this is that in order for us to be able to actually convince these people is to have this semblance of path that somehow already paved for them. um, I think that it's hard to change someone's mind when they don't see anything that leads to um, where you want them to be or where you recommend them to actually move forward to. And so that's the reason why you have builders in this space, which the primary motivation is to be able to actually have one developer at a time move into crypto and blockchain. So for me, it sometimes it's very moot. It's a moot point to like really convince them to like, hey, go here, do this. But I think like it's better to like set by example or give them the ability to actually understand and explore it, but at the same time give them all the tools without them necessarily sweating so much to really understand where you want them to be.
hmm, yeah, I'm feeling the same actually. When you don't feel like creating or doing the work, if you sometimes feel stuck, what do you do to get unstuck?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think everybody goes through that same phase. But for me, well, I'm based in Calgary in Canada. Um, one of the things that I do if I don't force myself to do things if nothing comes to me. So it's just a matter of either like I take a long walk, or I read a book, or I run, sort of like clears the mind somehow. And I think that it really would depend on like what you like in general. But I feel that an exploration of the things that you love doing is something that you somewhat need to tap into in order for you to somewhat feel inspired um, to do a specific work. So, for example, with OPGames, we're dealing with HTML5 games. We're building a platform right now, and I'm kind of like trying to figure out exactly how how incentives work or how I want to move people from one game to another within the platform and stuff like that. And so a lot of times I'm like, okay, how do I do this? Like I'm kind of stuck. Like I don't know exactly how it's done. Um, so you kind of draw inspiration from other things in general that could potentially lead you to a different level of understanding. So that's where like I play board game with friends, or I sort of like just contemplate and see if there's any other game that I can play that would allow me to somewhat, bring that insight into the platform. So sometimes you have to find it, and you don't necessarily have to find it in the same space that you're working on, because a lot of these processes and a lot of these things that you actually go through could be found in different aspects of the industry, and that's kind of like what I'm trying to do.
Mhm. And what's next for Outplay?
So what's next for OP Games? Next one would be our near protocol testnet, which is coming out very very soon. It's actually already in the testnet right now. It's already deployed. We just haven't announced the link yet. So there were a couple of changes that sort of like hindered us from announcing it last time. And one of that was the fact that we were doing some sort of like an in-game currency for the tournaments, as opposed to like doing it just directly with Near Protocol. So we've changed that completely, that mechanics, and so now we have about 8 games to 10 games in the platform. Some of them don't have tournaments, but some of them does. Those that have tournaments, anyone can just go in, buy in with Near Protocol, and if you happen to be the best one in that game, you can take away at least probably 70 to 60 or 80% of the prize pool for that specific game. So that's next for us. And then a couple of things NFT related as well is happening with OPGames. Essentially, we're working with a couple of games um, by turning their entire game into an NFT and then fractionalizing that into tiny little pieces that the community can own so that we'll have this ecosystem, a game ecosystem, a platform where most of the games are community owned.
Oh, this is beautiful. And also, last thing I wanted to also ask is about emerging economies, different geographies out there. From my understanding, like things like Axie Infinity, for example, have big communities in Philippines, for example. So we know it's already happening. What you are kind of considering to do and doing right now is already happening. Do you think that the 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 more participation will come from this kind of like new approach from the people in like emerging economies who would be potentially like earning because of this?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I for myself, I'm from the Philippines, and like the motivation of people in general would really lie around incentive. It doesn't matter whether you're in a tier one country or a tier two or tier three country. It's a matter of what kind of incentive is put forward for you to be able to actually invest your time and a little bit of what you have in a specific game or in a specific platform. And we think that emerging economies in general have that luxury because it's life is tough in general as well. It's especially with COVID on the horizon. A lot of people lost their jobs. They're looking for alternative ways as to how they can earn money. So play to earn is really killing it. And the reason for that is because it's accessible. It provides some sort of like immediate relief. It may not be exactly super big just yet, but that level of motivation comes in from trying to figure out exactly how to navigate life as well. And I think that that growth, as long as it helps people, or as long as there's this level of incentive that allows them to actually um, you know um, get more in general, as opposed to, like, say for example, um, doing other things that isn't commensurate to the effort that they do, then it will continuously grow. And I think that the Philippines, Southeast Asia, even Latin America, um, would see a sort of like growth in terms of like these types of economic loops.
Oh, and another interesting question I have is: do you see any tension between incentives and like creating incentives for people to like potentially earn, but also which is a great thing for people, right? But also on the other hand, there is this aspect of building communities where you kind of want to people to contribute as the community gets built because of their values and interest in the community, not because of the earning aspect of it. So do you see is there any like tension here, or it's kind of
Um, Somehow I think there is. And it's really up to the platform or whatever that game is um, that's building that specific community. They have to balance off, and we have to balance off, the amount of incentive that we provide with the amount of work that they put in to actually receive these incentives, because the motivation and the motivation of people could actually be looming into different directions. There are the motivation, there are people whose motivation is to actually make the game better or make the community and the platform more amazing than it is, right? And having the right incentive for them to do that allows them to do both. I mean, that's the goal, right? To have somebody who's aligned with the incentive, but also aligned with the mission and the values of like what you're building. And you have to really create that yourself because it's similar to like creating culture within your community. And if you don't really try to sort of like shape that, then they might just see you as somebody or something that that just churns out incentives, but not doesn't necessarily build anything of value. So I guess that's kind of like my answer to that. It's you know everybody is responsible for building that kind of culture, and I think that it's very important to have leaders in that space that sort of like is aligned with your vision and also empowering them, not just like you trying to control the narrative on how a platform or a game should look like or should be. You have to listen to the voices of the people too, especially if it's something that is community owned or partly owned, or the community has a huge stake on it.
Mhm. And where do game developers find more about OP Games?
So they can find out more about us at www.outplay.games. That's our website. But also we do have our Telegram and our Facebook and our Twitter. Twitter is at outplay underscore games. And the rest, I think, if you can just look for OP Games on Google, you'll find us.
Nice. Well, thank you for coming today. It was awesome.
Thank you, Sasha. I appreciate the time, and you have a wonderful day.